what we want to do is facilitate rural prosperity. We really want to work towards building communities and giving them the supports they need to move forward. And so it's really about making sure that we listen to what needs to be done, to provide expertise where we can, but to recognize that our role is to support them in helping them build and sustain.
Many rural communities are struggling to survive. A Kansas State University associate professor and extension specialist in the School of Family Studies and Human Services is part of a research team working to identify what people are looking for in a rural community and how these communities can meet those needs. On today's Sound Living, helping smaller communities thrive and survive. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. K-State Research and Extension Child Development Specialist Bradford Wiles is part of a project funded by agricultural experiment stations across the U.S., including Kansas State, to identify key community indicators for improving the health of rural communities and working with those communities to implement change to help them retain current residents as well as attract new families into the community.
We know our rural communities contribute greatly to our state's economy, to our state's identity. There's still this element of connection to the land around you that is very different in these far-flung communities. It can be a tremendous place to grow up, and I think it's incumbent upon us to be able to provide opportunities for families to contribute to the state and to the country in ways that are beneficial for all of us. We do know that in rural communities, transportation can be a gigantic barrier. And we're getting some good information about how rural communities can build their health, especially their resilience, right? So health and resilience really go together. The old adage, at least you have your health, right? People say that sort of as a joke sometimes, but truly, it's foundational. And so we think about health as this component of a larger element of resilience, right? Are we able to survive and thrive currently and in the future as a result of the resources that we have?
I think a lot of people think of rural health from the standpoint of older adults, and that's not the case. There are all age groups living in rural areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, we know that our rural population is aging, but we are all aging. And further, yes, if we want to maintain rural communities, we need young families. We need families with young children or who are going to have young children, and they exist. It's not to say that those families don't exist. They certainly do. And there are families from across the lifespan that are represented across rural communities. And when we think about health, too, the other element is we tend to almost always think about physical health. And in fact, we almost always think about health care. Health and health care are different ideas. Health is not just the absence of disease. Health is much more about our ability to live up to our potential. That's what health really is. Across the board, there's financial health, mental health, behavioral health, physical health, all the different healths that we live in and that we deal with. And so thinking about just age as a risk for physical health is not the only component of rural communities that really tells the full story of rurality and what it means to grow up in rural communities and to advance them and to provide for their survival and thriving in the future.
As you're looking at rural communities, do you have a rough definition of what a rural community is? Are you basing it on population or distance from a larger community?
Yeah, so this is such a good question. There are multiple different ways to look at this. The federal government uses their urban influence codes, as they're called, UICs, and they're really about this proximity to large urban areas and then people per square mile. There are some concerns about it, though. One of them is they tend to use them at the county level. And so, you can look at a county like Potawatomi County, which by some measures is not considered rural because it is near to Manhattan. And yet we know that so much of Potawatomi County is absolutely what you would define as rural. Very few people per square mile. And so what we've been doing on this research project, if we use a measure out of Washington State called RUCA codes, and these are this rural urban continuum codes. And what they do is they look at sub-elements of a county, of a community, to be able to really target what is rural, right? So if we think about Westmoreland, that's a perfect example of a community that is rural, even though it's in a county, Potawatomi, that currently is not considered rural because of its proximity to Manhattan. And so it's really important that we, as scientists, conceptualize rurality to reflect the reality of what it is. So it's a really good question, and one that, without getting bogged down in the details, is something that's really critical when we talk about making recommendations and how we work towards policy and practice changes, because it's one thing to try to do something differently. And by the way, Riley County is another perfect example, city of Manhattan. And yet, you go up to Riley, it's a small rural community. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And it's something that we grapple with as social scientists, as extension specialists, making sure that we reflect the needs of communities so that we're able to tell the story in ways that will benefit them.
Because in some cases you're saying that that community might have a grocery store. It might have some health access. It might have better transportation. It might have no transportation. So you're having a chance to really compare these communities and maybe gauging the health of those communities based on what is available and what isn't available?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a good point, is that it's not just deficits. We don't just look at deficits. We really look at what assets communities have. Historically, we only looked at things that communities didn't have. And so what would happen is we would just miss this other part of the picture. We would only look at things that didn't exist, like community pool, a library, or, a grocery store, these other things, which, don't get me wrong, are really important, but we weren't looking at the strengths, the assets they had. So maybe instead of a community pool, they have a lake that substitutes as that. They have a community college whose library is open to the public. So it's not a public library, but it still gives children and families across the lifespan ages access to books, right? And all the other things that libraries do now. Like when you and I were growing up, you went and you got a book, maybe 5, and went back home. Now you can do that, but you can also get CDs, audio books. You can use their computers. You can go there for community gatherings, for songs for children, all sorts of different things. And so, when we think about communities, it's really important that we look across what they have as equal or greater than what they don't have. Because we know in rural communities, things are very differently valuable than they are in urban communities.
I would think that the availability of a meeting place would be really important.
Yeah, it certainly is. One of the hallmarks of healthy rural communities is civic engagement, right? We know that really strong, really healthy rural communities are concerned about what's going on in their communities, and they have places to come together and work that out. In very small communities, churches serve this role. And in fact, in some larger rural communities, they still serve that role. It's a perfect place. But all other elements of having a strong meeting place are absolutely critical. Libraries can serve that function. You can think about high schools or grade schools, any place where you can engage the community in a way that's not terribly difficult for them to find or find themselves in are really helpful. Some communities just don't have that, and so that's part of what we're trying to figure out, are what are the ways that we can build capacity for those things.
You mentioned something that kind of sparked my interest when you mentioned schools, because I'm thinking, does that come into play? Do people want to be within so many miles at least in rural areas of a school?
Yeah, ideally, absolutely. But what we know with school consolidation is that sometimes they just don't have that opportunity anymore, right? So families that have been there for generations were able to go to a school that was fairly proximal to their house, and now the bus is taking their kids for, in some cases an hour or more to get to school and back. And so, yes, as with anyone looking to relocate, you're looking at a few things, particularly if you have children. Quality of schools. Rural schools can be very, very high quality. In particular, one of the advantages is the ratio of teachers to students can be greatly reduced. So you get more one-on-one or smaller class sizes. So it's important for us to consider that those are advantages, not always disadvantages. They can be, though, right? If it takes you an hour each way, that's a lot of time traveling.
Are you also looking to find out whether the community is moving forward, what they're doing to maybe address any shortcomings that they think they might have.
Yes, and in fact, what we really want to do is help with that process. So our work in Extension is very much about making a difference in people's lives. And while studying what's going on is interesting and is very important for us as we move forward, what we want to do is facilitate rural prosperity. We really want to work towards building communities and giving them the supports they need to move forward. The first step in that process is always find out where we are. And then instead of us riding in and on our white horses and saying, this is what's wrong with you and let's fix this, which we know never works for multiple different reasons, it's really about helping communities identify the needs that they have. I work a lot with communities on access to quality, affordable childcare because of its central component to those things that we talked about, recruiting and retaining young families, building the workforce of the future, having opportunity there, freeing up the labor force, right? When people can put their children in care, they can then contribute to the local economy. And so it's really incumbent upon us as Extension and as rural family specialists to really build in those supports that are guided by local communities. It's really about making sure that we listen to what needs to be done to provide expertise where we can, but to recognize that our role is to support them in ways that we know work from other examples and in helping them build and sustain.
I think we also have to realize that a lot of people that grow up in rural areas want to go back to those areas, but they have to have a reason or they have to have something that draws them back and something that can sustain them and their families.
Yeah, the reason people move to different places, frankly, is opportunity. And rural communities have tremendous opportunity if they have this community capacity, right? This ability to attract, retain talent. We want people to come back. And yes, anyone who's grown up in a rural community will tell you, just like anybody else who's grown up anywhere, there are benefits and there are deficits to it. But it is very attractive for people who particularly have that experience. And we know that through decades of research that people who grow up in rural communities often want to go back to rural communities. It's providing them opportunity. Some of the barriers to that are jobs, and in particular, jobs for two-parent households. Being able to have access to quality, affordable childcare helps with that two-household income. Access to health care is another element. Having community resources, good schools, libraries, grocery stores are an incredible component of the sense of place. Grocery stores are essentially the you don't know what you've got till it's gone story of rural communities. And the folks over at the Center for Engagement and Community Development have been doing a great job on that. Again, it's this balance of what we know is good and what rural communities really need for their individual communities.
I know you're still doing research, but what's the next step? Where do you go from here?
The next steps are working with some of the communities that we have been working with on their needs assessments, so figuring out what it is that they need, and then identifying resources in the community to help them bridge that gap. We've done some work out in Wichita County towards the very far end of the state. We've done some work down in Cherokee County. So we're really working towards building these resources. So in Wichita County, they're working on getting a full-time childcare up and running and identifying partnerships, identifying investors to really help the small community of Leota get going. Those are the next steps, is move away from figuring out what they need to putting in practice the things that we know will alleviate some of those needs.
And this will all be part of a larger report at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the work that we do with the North Central Region Project is always part of our annual reports, and then we have every 5 years we do reports. So one just came out. We're starting on the Rural Families Speak About Resilience, and that's where a lot of this community level and individual and family level work really has some fruit to bear.
That's K-State Research and Extension Child Development Specialist Bradford Wiles with an update on efforts to help rural communities thrive and survive. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.